and maintain the things that we're doing. Try to work hard and advance the conservative cause. And that's one of the things I'm doing in this campaign is I've not been afraid to go anywhere, talk to anybody, speak to anybody. I don't really care what color your skin is or what language you speak or where you came from. If you believe in these principles that you have lined up right here, if you believe in those principles, then I think you belong in the Republican Party. And a few weeks ago, about a month and a half ago now, I went to y'all see on the news what's happening in Venezuela and the socialist government that's gripping that nation. And so one of the opposition parties, the anti-socialist parties in Venezuela, asked Venezuelan citizens all across the world to go and have like a straw poll and send a message to the government. Do they want them to, do they like the path that they're taking of socialism, or do they want them to follow their constitution in Venezuela? So 7,000 people showed up in 2 locations not far from my house and voted. And I went over there and I thought, I think it's important. It's a Sunday afternoon. I thought it was important for them to see at least one Republican come and shake their hand and say, you know what, if you're against socialism, then the Republican Party is a friend of yours. And 7,000 people voted. You want to know how many said, well, we support what the government's doing? Less than 5 out of that 7,000. So they sent a strong message. Venezuelan citizens who live here in the United States, who own businesses, they're here legally, they own businesses, they productive members of our community, and they're against socialism. So they should be looking at the Republican Party and saying, hey, we agree with those principles and we stand with them. So that's one of the things I'm doing as I campaign is I'll go anywhere. I'll talk to anybody who will listen to a Republican or a conservative message. Now, there's a lot of important issues in this race, as you well know, for Secretary of State. I see Andrew here, who works in the Secretary of State's office, and our friend Brian Kemp gets sued all the time by Democrats trying to change the election laws. And so that elections obviously are a critically important part of the Secretary of State's job. And so I just want to tell you, if I'm Secretary of State, I'll follow what Mr. Kemp has done, and we'll fight the Democrats hard, tooth and nail, to make sure that our elections are fair. We saw some of that happening in the 6th District race, right? They sued to try to extend voter registration, and they won, and they were able to register people, it was kind of changing the rules in the middle of the game, which was very unfortunate. But some other things that they did that I think that we can address would be the DeKalb County Elections Board decided to open up new early voting places in the runoff that had not been open in the primary, in the special election. And why is that important? Well, it was pushed by left-wing groups. And they were saying, well, it's not fair, we need them in these places that vote heavily Democratic. They weren't doing it because they thought it would help Karen Handel. Or they weren't doing it because they thought it would be fair and give voters more fair access to the polls. They were doing it because they thought it would help John Ossoff win. And thankfully it didn't work. But these are the kind of things that you need the Secretary of State to stand up against and say, no, we're not going to allow that to happen. Everybody, every citizen, no matter who they might support, is going to have equal access to the polls. And so that's something that I think is very important. Another thing that's very important, I think, is the voting machines that we have. They're getting old. And it's getting harder for local elections officials to get them up and running, have enough of them up and running for the elections. So that's something that we're going to have to address in the next few years. We're going to have to figure out, we're going to have to work with the legislature to figure out how we're going to pay for this. We're going to have to work with our next governor to figure out what we're going to do. And the kind of process I would like us to see, happen here in Georgia, would be an open and transparent process. Y'all remember what happened, how we got the machines that we have today back in 2002. That was in the wake of the Bush versus Gore election. Remember in Florida, everybody was staring at those little pieces of paper and trying to figure out, all right, is that a hanging chad? Is that really a vote? And all these sorts of things. And so people said, we need to modernize our election system. And so all across the country, people bought new voting machines. But unfortunately, what happened here in Georgia, we had a Democratic Secretary of State. And she didn't have an open and transparent process that brought experts in from across the country that was transparent so the members of the public could know what was going on. She just said, we're going to use that machine right there. And so that's the machine we all used. And so here we are 10 years later. And so I don't want to see us go through that process again. I want to see us have a process where we, as the citizens of Georgia, are deciding what sort of election system do we want and what's best for our state. And if there's not a machine out there that exists, then maybe we build our own. We've got the technology in the state to do that. But we use that as leverage to tell these voting machine companies we want it to be done right. We want to have a verifiable backup system. I want to see a system that has paper backup so that we can all look at that and we can know for sure when you and I go to the polls, we know that our ballot was cast the way we want it to be cast, and we don't have to worry about that. Now, what's kind of scary in my mind is there was a poll recently that asked Republicans and Democrats, what do they think about voting machines? And 59% of Democrats said they were convinced, not only did the Russians try to influence the election, they're convinced that Russians hacked into voting machines and changed votes to help Mr. Trump. No proof of that whatsoever, but Republicans, we're worried too. We were worried about that there are people who shouldn't be voting who are ineligible to vote. Millions of these votes cast. So there are 52% of Republicans who think that that's the case. So what that says to me, what's scary for elected officials in all of that to me is we've gone beyond the time where you say, all right, I'm a Republican and a Democrat one, I'm disappointed. Now people are looking and saying that vote was illegitimate because the Russians hacked it, or there were people who shouldn't be voting. And if that thought continues, then it's going to undermine our trust in government, which is already not real strong, right? It's going to continue to undermine our trust in government to where people don't even respect the people who are elected. And it's going to make it very tough for elected officials to get stuff done. So I think this is something we're going to have to grapple with. And I think we can do that through an open and transparent process of looking at our voting machines when we need to replace them and coming up with something that we all, as citizens of Georgia, like and can trust and can believe in and have the security that we need to make sure there are no hacks and make sure that our voter list is clean so that we know for sure that only eligible citizens are voting. And that's the kind of thing that I want to do if I'm Secretary of State. If the voters of this state elect me and the good Lord puts me in there, that's the kind of things that I'll work on. Now, one other thing I'll mention about the job of Secretary of State, and then, Mr. Chairman, it's all right if folks want to ask questions, whatever the format is, we'll be happy to do that. But another very important part of the Secretary of State's job is professional licensing. And excuse me. And what we've seen in recent years is, even since I've been in the legislature, people wanted to create new licenses to license new professions, and new burdens being put on people in those professions to make it harder to get into those professions. And that's something that I think concerns me. And so I started digging into this, and I found out that there's an entity in state government already to deal with that. It's called the Georgia Occupational Regulation Review Council. Now, of course, only government could come up with a name like that, right? But anyway, this thing exists to do two things. Number one, when somebody proposes a new license, it looks at it and says, okay, yes, we think that this profession needs to be licensed, or no, we don't think it does. And then legislators can make an educated decision as to whether to license that or not. But the second thing it does, excuse me, second thing it does is to review, it's supposed to, once every 7 years, review each each current license and determine whether that license needs to continue to be existed, or whether we should lessen the burdens on that particular profession. And so I called them up, and I said, hey, where can I find these reports that you did, these periodic reviews of these professions? And they said, well, we don't do that. And I said, what do you mean you don't do that? I'm looking at the law right here. It says you're supposed to do it. They said, well, the legislature requires us to account for all our money through zero-based budgeting, so we've decided that we can't do that. I said, well, so I dropped and introduced a resolution, House Resolution 744, that's alive in the legislature now, and I hope we can bring this to light next year, and either get them the money they need to do their job, or shame them into following the law, whichever works. But I think that's critically important. We need to know if you are somebody who works in a profession that's licensed, you need to know that the burdens that are placed on you are not more than there should be. Or that the profession even needs to be licensed, like librarians. I mean, I hope there's no librarians in here, but I really don't know that we need to license librarians in the state of Georgia. I think what we probably can do is a certification process. Do you have the education that you need? All right, here you go, you can become a librarian. And the reason this is important really boils down to jobs, right? We want everybody in Georgia to be gainfully employed in whatever profession they want to be employed in. And if we're throwing up barriers and we're making it harder and harder to do that, then we're hurting families and we're hurting people. So that's certainly not something that we as Republicans and conservatives stand for. So I think that this is something that's critically important that we need to continue to work on. And it's something that I will continue to talk about on the campaign trail. Every now and then I get opposition to that, and it's normally from somebody who sits on a board who wants to continue to license that profession and make it tougher for anybody else to join that profession. But I'll continue to work on that because I think it's very important for our economy here in Georgia. And last thing I'll say is this. One of my favorite movies is the movie Braveheart. And there's a great scene in that movie where William Wallace looks at the Scottish nobles. And I think that what he says really applies to politics today. He looks at the Scottish nobles and he says, you think that the people exist to provide you with a position. So, but I think your position exists to provide people with freedom. And I think there's so much cynicism in politics these days. And a lot of it has to do, I think, that people have looked at a lot of politicians and have concluded that they think that all we are as citizens exists to give them a position in government, when really the opposite should be true. Our Constitution here in Georgia creates the office of governor, or secretary of state, or whatever it is, all the way down to mayors and city councilmen. Those positions were created really to do one thing, and that's to protect your freedom. And so if I'm Secretary of State, I can promise you I'll wake up every morning and I'll keep that in mind. And I'll remember that this position is there to protect your freedom through free and fair elections, for giving you the ability to follow your dreams and start your own company in the corporations division, or help you get a professional license in whatever profession you want to pursue. And that's how I'll look at it, and that's what I'll do. So again, thank you very much for the time and for inviting me up here. We've got some literature back here and a sign-up sheet if you want to get on our email list. And my website's really easy to find at voteforbuzz.com. And I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn, all those things that the kids do these days. But pretty easy to get a hold of. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll be happy, as time allows, Mr. Chairman, to take any questions. I know you've got a fantastic speaker here following me, so I'll be brief. But yes, ma'am.
Well, perhaps you did this and it went over my head. At my age, that happens a lot. Did you tell us anything about yourself personally?
I did not, actually. I'm sorry. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. So my name's Buzz Brockway. My family moved to Georgia in 1976 to Gwinnett County. And back then, Gwinnett was a small county, a rural county almost. But I've been married for 24 years to my wife, Krista. We've got three daughters who are all teenagers now. Well, one's almost a teenager, but my oldest one just turned 19. She's about to start. Well, started today, except they canceled all the classes. She was going to start today at the University of North Georgia. Wants to pursue nursing, and so I'm a blessed man. Got involved in the Republican Party in 1997, and back then they were scrambling to try to find people to go to conventions. So a buddy of mine walked into work one of my coworkers just walked in one day and said, "Hey, you're a delegate to the 1997 Republican convention." I said, "Oh, okay." I didn't know what that was, but I went and got involved, and I've been involved in the Republican Party ever since. And I've served in the House. I'm in my fourth term in the House. I'll serve for 7 years now, and I will complete my term next year. I'm not gonna resign or anything, but so that's a little bit about me. I'm active in our church, Victory World Church in Beaufort, Georgia, not far from our house, and we've been active members there. My wife and I lead a Bible study for married couples to try to help folks have strong marriages. So, anything else you want to know about me, just feel free to ask. But thank you for reminding me of that. Thank you. Yes, sir.
President Trump's council or commission on voter fraud across the country, looking at the states, been meeting some resistance there. Could you touch on that?
Yeah, I think we should support it. And I think Secretary Kemp did the exact right thing, and I'll explain. There's been a lot of discussion about what he did, but what he really did is, I think, the right thing, because unfortunately the commission asked for some information. They asked for Social Security numbers. In Georgia, they really shouldn't have ever asked for that. And Georgia law prohibits us from giving that to them. So what Secretary Kemp did was provide them the list in compliance with Georgia law, which incidentally is the same list that if you wanted to buy, you could go on the Secretary of State's website and buy. But we should cooperate as much as we can, obviously within the limits of Georgia law. And I think that's what Secretary Kemp is doing, and if I'm elected, I'll continue to do that. What they're driving at is presidents, really almost every president in the last several presidencies has formed a commission sort of like this. President Obama did one because he wanted to see that lines were shorter at polling places, because if y'all remember when he was first elected, there were enormous lines and 5 hours long and stuff. So they made some improvements, and so I'm hopeful that what President Trump's commission will do is really take a hard look at how we maintain voter lists. I think that's what the main purpose of what they're driving at, to make sure that we don't have ineligible people on voter lists where that opens up the door for fraud. And that's very important, and I'm hopeful that this commission will come up with some great ideas of how we can work on that, and I will certainly cooperate with that commission. Thank you for asking that. Other question? Yes, ma'am.
Is there any opposition for voter ID?
It's funny. In my experience, what I've seen is that there's broad bipartisan support among people for voter ID. The opposition you get really is from Democratic leaders, Democratic politicians. And there was a great video on the internet a couple months ago where they went and talked to people who said they were against voter ID. And they said, "Why are you against voter ID?" Well, because nobody, in veiled language, what they were saying is that certain people can't get driver's license. So then they went to African Americans and said, "Do you have a driver's license?" "Yeah, of course I do." And so they found that the complaints that liberals thought they had against voter ID doesn't exist. And if y'all remember back when Karen Handel was Secretary of State and this program was first implemented in Georgia, she set up a bus and drove around Georgia and said, "Anybody who needs an ID, we will give it to you." And so it's very easy. What we need to look at really is folks who might not be able to. 95% of the folks have a driver's license, so that solves the problem right there. What we've got to look at is make sure that those 5% that don't have driver's licenses for one reason or another are able to get an ID card. And as long as we're doing normal, reasonable things to make sure that happens, voter ID is not a problem at all, and does remain popular among voters. So thanks for the question. So one back here.
Yeah, last one. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, if government is getting too big across the board, what do you have planned to help reduce that?
Yeah, so as it applies to the Secretary of State's office, I may have my numbers wrong here, and it's kind of embarrassing because we have a guy who works for the Secretary of State's office. He didn't correct me, but Secretary of State's office is actually one that generates more revenue than it costs to run the office. So through licensing fees and so forth. So the challenge there is to make sure that we're spending the right amount of money. And I think we've been doing that going back through Secretary Kemp's administration, back to Secretary Handel's administration. We've been very diligent about that, and I would certainly continue that. We've just got to make sure that we don't spend. Government likes to grow every year, and so what we've got to make sure is that just doesn't happen. And so I would be very diligent about making sure that we're not asking the legislature for more money than we need to do our job. And I think the budget that we have there is pretty good. So we don't need to increase it. We need to do that. And look, what I studied in college, and yes, I did go to Georgia Tech, and I hope you don't hold that against me, but you know, I'm kind of a nerdy guy, and the Secretary of State's office is kind of a nerdy position. And so what I studied in college and what I did professionally for a long time was I studied management science, and that's where you sit around and look at processes and figure out how to make them more efficient. So we've got to apply that kind of thinking to everything that's done in the Secretary of State's office. Are we delivering the services that the Constitution requires us to do is in as an efficient manner as possible? And I think there's opportunities there to look at that and squeeze out some savings and make sure that we're being as efficient as possible. But we'll keep a sharp eye on that. Thanks for the question. And again, thank you for your time, and I appreciate it.
I'm sure he'll be around for a second after the meeting's over with, in case you need to come up and ask him a question, something you think of between now and then.